It is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. We are honored to welcome Secretary Andrew H. Card, Jr., who began his political career actually in his hometown, but he also began his political career here in this very room as a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives from 1975 to 1983. Actually, so did my father back in the 1950s, and I was 12 years old, and I think he sat right over there. I can't remember. He was here for 10 years. Secretary Card served as U.S. Secretary of Transportation. He then served and has the second longest tenure as the White House Chief of Staff. That, as part of his other great accomplishments, came with great responsibilities. Unfortunately, one of those was at a critical time at September 11th, when he informed President George W. Bush of the attacks that have occurred, and he played a significant role in the response from the government that followed. Therefore, please join me in welcoming back to this House of Representative chambers Secretary Andrew H. Card, Jr., a true honor to have him with us in this day of commemoration. Secretary.
Thank you for that introduction. Reverend clergy, thank you for being here. Governor Baker, your leadership is inspiring and makes a difference. Speaker DeLeo, thank you. Mayor Walsh, thank you. Constitutional officers, state legislators, elected officials, most significantly, those of you who cannot forget. Chances are you probably remember exactly what you were doing on September 11, 2001. You remember the emotions that day. You probably woke up that day to a glorious world. It was a perfect day in America. The skies were clear. There literally was not a cloud in the lower 48 states that day. It was a glorious day. But then someone boarded a plane in Portland, Maine, and flew to Logan Airport and got on another plane. It turns out others boarded planes. And they took off. The planes weren't full, but people were excited to be traveling. Their stories were filled with hope. And then there was the horror. Horror first experienced on the planes. And then the horror of planes being flown into buildings. Thousands of truly innocent victims. Citizen responders, first responders, and heroes, and so much more on September 11th, 2001. We promised to never forget, to remember to remember. Yes, on September 11th, 2001, I was with the President in Sarasota, Florida. And I remember that glorious morning, and the President getting ready to go for a run on the golf course, He was particularly nervous because he had invited a reporter to go running with him, and then he found out he'd been an NCAA All-American cross-country runner. And the Bushes are very competitive. They don't let their grandkids beat them at checkers. And George W. Bush didn't want this reporter to beat him on the golf course. And the president was preoccupied with that. But he went out and ran. I did what a chief of staff has to do every day. I read through the intelligence reports, the news of the day, the economic reports, went to check on the staff to make sure the motorcade was being set up right, and the president would be prepared to go to the Emma E. Booker School, an elementary school, to talk about his very favorite topic, leaving no child behind in education. He came back from the run, and he was kind of George Bush cocky. He had a strut. He beat Stretch Kyle, that reporter. He ran pretty good times, and he felt full of himself. And I remember saying to him, get dressed, you're going to a school, it's your favorite topic. It'll be an easy day. When we loaded into vehicles to go over to the Emma E. Booker School, and yes, they were Suburbans and limousines, I did hear a buzz. Two senior staffers said, "Did you hear about a plane crash in New York City?" We arrived at the Emma E. Booker School and were greeted by the principal of the school and went into a classroom that had been converted into a White House command center. Secure telephones, computers, a handful of staffers. And the president went to a secure phone and called back to Washington, D.C., and talked with his national security advisor, Dr. Condoleezza Rice. I didn't hear that conversation. I had stepped into a classroom to see if it was ready to greet the president. And I saw those second graders lined up, getting ready to go in the classroom. And boy, they were excited, and they were on their very best behavior. I saw a pool of reporters gathered to be part of the press pool. They were never on their best behavior, but they were there, anxious to get into that classroom. I looked around the classroom to make sure things were set. I actually saw a misspelled word on a bulletin board. Get a book cover and cover that word. I didn't want a potato moment. I then walked back into the holding room. And when I stepped into the holding room, standing with the principal of the school and the president, the acting director of the White House Situation Room came up to the president, a Navy captain, and she said, "Sir, it appears a small twin-engine prop plane crashed into one of the towers at the World Trade Center in New York City." The president, the principal of the school, and I had exactly the same reaction. Oh, what a horrible accident. The pilot must have had a heart attack or something. And then the principal opened the door to the classroom, and she and the president walked into the classroom. When the door shut, with me still in the holding room, Navy Captain Deb Lauer came up to me and said, "Sir, it appears it was not a small twin-engine prop plane. It was a commercial jetliner." My mind flashed to the fear that the passengers on that plane must have had. They had to know it wasn't gaining altitude. I don't know why that's where my mind went, but that's where it went. But that was only a nanosecond. because Captain Lauer came right back up to me and said, "Oh my God, another plane hit the other tower." My mind then flashed to three initials, UBL, Osama bin Laden. I had known about the attacks on the World Trade Center in 1992. I then performed a test that chiefs of staff have to perform all the time. Does the president need to know? This was an easy test, yes. I thought about what I would say. I knew that he needed to know. But I also knew where he was. He was sitting in front of second graders, in front of a pest pool. Chances are there was a boom microphone hanging over his head. And I thought carefully about what I would say. I decided to pass on 2 facts and then make 1 editorial comment, and to do nothing to invite a dialogue with the president. I opened the door to the classroom and entered from behind the president. He didn't see me. He didn't hear me. Almost no one paid attention to me, except for Ann Compton from ABC News, who was in the press pool. And it was unusual for me to enter the room after the president had gone in, especially to come in from kind of backstage. And she said, and I said, and she said, and then the teacher of those second graders, who had been conducting a dialogue between the students and the president, told the students to take out their books. They were going to read with the president. And while the students were reaching for their books, I walked up to the president from behind and leaned over and whispered into his right ear, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack." I then stood back from the president so that he couldn't ask me a question. We didn't have a dialogue. I saw his head bobbing up and down. I then took a few more steps back, looked again, and the students were entirely attentive on their books. The press corps was huddled with Ari Fleischer, the press secretary, and the president was sitting there with his head bobbing up and down. I was pleased with how the president reacted. He did nothing to introduce fear to those second graders. He did nothing to demonstrate fear to the media that would have translated it to the satisfaction of the terrorists all around the world. I was also pleased that he was contemplating his responsibility. I stepped into that holding room and I made sure things were ready. The first thing I said was, "Get the FBI director on the phone." I asked the military to get the pilot and the crew back on Air Force One. To the Secret Service, I said, "Turn the motorcade around and get ready to go. We're going to have to leave." To our communications director, I said, "Get some remarks written for the president. We've got 600 people in the gymnasium. He will have to say something to them, but he cannot say anything we do not know to be the truth." Then the president entered the holding room. Anytime the president enters a room, it seems like everybody gloms onto the president, and it was no different that day. And the first thing he said was, get the FBI director on the phone. And we could say, right here, Mr. President. But whispering those words, America is under attack, I'm convinced caused the president to reflect on his job. Not the speeches that he had given, but the oath he had taken. The job of president. To preserve, protect, and defend. That day changed our lives. It changed President George W. Bush's life. We promised never to forget those 2,977 innocent victims. They were on flights, American Airlines 11, United Airlines Flight 175, American Airlines Flight 77, Flight 11, Flight 77, and then United Flight 93. The innocents were in the World Trade Center, at their desks in the Pentagon. And then there were others, first responders, who got the call and answered the call. And they rushed toward the challenge. They didn't run from it. We promised to remember those people, the ones that charged to make a difference, the civilians that were on Flight 93, that huddled together, actually said prayers, and then said, "Let's roll." Their actions, the first heroes in the war on terror, probably prevented a likely strike on the U.S. Capitol, and instead created hallowed ground in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. We promised to remember firefighters and EMTs, law enforcement officials, others who became first responders because there was a need. So many people answered the call to duty. And we promised never to forget. One of the most emotional experiences for me with President Bush was at an event that you couldn't see on television. You weren't invited, and even the president didn't know he was going there. He'd already been down to ground zero. It was September 14th, 2001. And you remember that. The crowd chanting, "USA, USA." Someone saying, "We can't hear you, we can't hear you." And the president saying, "I can hear you, and the whole world will hear us." And he rallied the rescue workers that came from every state in the Union and 38 countries around the world. But then, not on his schedule, he was asked to go into a room that had been created out of pipe and blue drapes. And it was in a corner of the Jacob Javits Center in New York City. And I remember when the president stepped out of his limousine, he says to the advance man, "What's this?" The advance man says, "We've gathered some family members of the police and firemen that are missing down at Ground Zero. And there's a podium set up, and we thought you could offer some remarks, take about 10 minutes to speak with them." And the president said, "I am not going to the podium." And he walked ahead of the Secret Service and just kind of barged into this room without being announced. And normally when the president walks into a room, it's announced, and everybody stands up and kind of lines up. He walked in unannounced. People were sitting down, hovering in corners. And the president went to every single one of them. And oh, there was hope. My husband is a professional. He knows what he's doing. He'll be okay. My daughter's been trained for this. They need her. She'll come out. My son, this is his life. He'll make it out. There was tremendous fear. There was anger. There were prayers. Lots of tears. Lots of hugs. And the president went to every single person. As we're getting ready to leave, I'll never forget what happened. A woman who had been sitting in a chair by a column, short, courageous. She was one of the first people the president greeted when he walked into the room. Stood up and took 2 steps to the president. Looked up into his eyes and held out her hand. "Mr. President, this is my son's badge. His name is George Howard. Don't ever forget." And with tears streaming down his cheeks, in fact, everyone was crying, the president took the badge, squeezed it, and looked at Mrs. Howard and said, "Mrs. Howard, America will forget. They'll start to move on. But don't worry about me. I will never forget." With tears streaming down our cheeks, we left the room, piled into a limousine, and I'm sitting right beside the president. He reaches into his pocket with the tears still streaming down his cheeks, and he pulls out this badge, opens his hand. It was badge number 1012. He looks at it, doesn't say anything. He closes it and squeezes his hands and puts it back in his pocket. He carried that badge with him for the rest of his presidency. He will never forget. But he also convicted me to never forget. You will never forget You were touched in a way that nobody wants to be touched. But there are tens of thousands of others that we know that want to move on, want to forget, don't want to remember. It's been 17 years, and for many people in America today, the story of September 11th, 2001 is 2 pages in a history book and a photograph. It could be a photograph of first responders. Could be a photograph of the president standing on a crushed vehicle with his arms around a fireman and a bullhorn in his hand. It could be a picture of a lowly chief of staff from Holbrook, Massachusetts, who used to sit right there in this chamber, whispering in the president's ear. It's an iconic photograph. I am not iconic. But if that picture causes people to remember, to never forget, the job has been done. We honor you. We honor those who were lost. We honor those who answered the call to duty and continue to answer the call to duty. Ours is an entirely volunteer army. People step up and say yes. We're a great people. We have great faith. We love God and we love our country. And I pray that you will help everyone remember what we are about. Because September 11th, 2001 gave more definition to what we are about than any other act in our lifetime. So, every September 11th, thousands of people gather. They gather in New York City. They gather at the Pentagon. They gather in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. They gather in capitals all around the world. We gather in a special place at our State House in Boston because we had a unique connection to 9/11. But we gather to keep a promise. My wife is gathered, she's a minister. She's gathered at the Cathedral of the Pines in Rindge, New Hampshire, where every name was being read, bells were being tolled, and they became a conscience to remember, to remember. Never forget. Thank you, and God bless you.